Thank you for the opportunity to share my research with you today. My name is Penny Rabiger. I'm a PhD student at Leeds Beckett University, just starting my third year. I've been the lead coach on the Leeds Beckett University Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality's Anti-Racist School Award since its inception in 2020. I was a teacher for over a decade and I've been working freelance on anti-racism in schools for a number of years now. I want to briefly describe the sequence of events that led to some schools noticing racism and to the Leeds Beckett Anti-Racist School Award being created in response to requests for support from teachers and leaders. In the spring of 2020, the brutal public execution by a white police officer of a black citizen, George Floyd, in the USA brought the concept of structural racism into sharp focus for some students, teachers and leaders of schools in the UK and compelled them to want to do something about racism in their institutions. Among the many responses to the seemingly suddenly revealed realities of structural racism in our public institutions, schools sought out structured programs, awards, courses and kite marks that could support them on their journey to learn about racism, tackle race inequality and distance themselves from being complicit as racists. My research builds on work over the course of 3 years with a group of around 100 teachers and school leaders whose schools chose to embark on the 2-year Anti-Racist School Award programme designed and delivered by the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality. It outlines research into processes teachers appointed as award leads at their schools go through when engaging with structural racism within their own institutions. And the study is anchored in a phenomenological perspective. It's a small scale study which seeks to answer the following questions. What happens to people who lead on anti-racism efforts in their schools? What are their motivations for embarking on and persevering with the award? And what are the expected and unexpected outcomes of this work? The study explores data gathered through semi-structured in-depth interviews of 90 to 120 minutes with 10 participants at various stages of leading their schools through the award programme. And the transcripts of the interviews were shared with participants for validation following the in-depth interviews, and they were invited to complete a reflection exercise by commenting on what stood out for them from the transcript of our conversation. So the study is framed within the contextual realities of schools in England during the 2020s, which are of course influenced by history, geography, demographics, national, regional and local politics. And although the number of participants is small, they span different geographies, a range of different racialized identities, school phases, as well as different stages on the award process. In broad terms, the epistemological approach of this study is underpinned by social constructivism as the collective generation and transmission of meaning, with an emphasis on understanding the ways in which we are shaped by our cultural experiences and the ability to critically engage with this. Transcripts were therefore analysed for identifiable themes using grounded theory method, inductive and deductive analysis, a series of read-throughs and a system of coding starting with open coding, which isolated broad themes and which were then honed using axial coding and selective analysis to draw out pertinent themes. In terms of the conceptual framework, due to shortness of time today, I'll just demonstrate my analysis on a couple of key themes arising from the award leaders as a taster, and then I'll end with 3 recommendations for educational practice, policy or further research. So this research is grounded in 2 linked theoretical and involving disciplines of critical race theory, CRT, and critical whiteness studies, CWS. And so my findings are analysed with these very much in mind. A few of the basic tenets of CRT and CWS that underpin my work are as follows, and I'll explain these in more detail and I'll give a couple of illustrations of how they come into play in my research findings. So first off, the race as a social construct, and this idea will most likely be familiar to you, that race is a socially constructed phenomenon, an imagined set of physiological, psychological and behavioural tendencies perceived as either good or bad, positive or negative, and these imagined associations were created by dominant groups to justify the oppression, denigration and exploitation of their colonised subjects based on assumed inferiority, lack of morals or a lack of capacity for self-determination. Two main underpinnings of CRT are firstly an understanding, to cite Kimberly Crenshaw, of how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of colour have been created and maintained, and a commitment, to cite Gloria Ladson-Billings, to change the bonds that exists between law and racial power, which is coherently transferred over to education and other sites, social sites. We need to include the concepts of intersectionality and anti-essentialism here, which incorporate the notion that a group's experience can't be described in isolation from other aspects of that person, that there's no essence to such experience and no one ever just shows up as their perceived race, class, or gender alone. It's important as well to differentiate between white people as a socially constructed identity, usually based on skin color, as Susie Leonardo says, and whiteness as a racial discourse. For many participants in my study, if not all, this social construction idea was a starting point. Some were engaged in unraveling where that construct comes from and how some notions that they held about the significance and operation of race in staffing, curriculum, pedagogy, and educational outcomes were a direct result of the constructions of race that correlate with deficit narratives around potential and capabilities of people of colour. They realized how they just accepted this as built into the system as educators or tried to work around it. Second off is racism is normal, not aberrant. What sets critical race theory apart and often makes it viewed as radical or contentious by some is the views that it views racism as inherent at all levels of social and political life, that is socially constructed and reproduced within institutions such as education and the law. CRT encompasses an acknowledgement of what Zeus Leonardo refers to as the complete racialization of daily life. And again, all participants saw the work that they were engaged in through the award as a kind of wake-up call to how embedded racism is and how usualized it is. And I'll bring this to life in a minute. And thirdly, the permanence of racism. So Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, is one of CRT's founding statements. It's a seminal piece of work in which Bell sets the scene that race is, quote, permanently embedded in the psychology, economy, society, and culture of the modern world. In other words, the civil rights movement fought and won some legislative victories, but it didn't lead to a post-racial society. And this poses a real challenge for anti-racism work, as the question will be whether advances around equal opportunity, representation, or diversity can do more than maintain racial inequities at manageable levels. In some ways, the aim of anti-racism work is not to aspire to the unattainable goal of a post-racial society and the eradication of racism, but rather to improve conditions where gains can be made. And CRT posits that powerful elites in structurally racist societies don't reform willingly. The award leads definitely found this during their work in schools. So just to bring it to life with a couple of quotes from my in-depth interviews, here we see such a clear expression that racism, far from being only visible in its most extreme forms, is normal, not aberrant. It's in the fabric of every single thing. It appears in everyday life. It's so ingrained that it looks ordinary and natural. It's a permanent fixture, and consequently for CRT theorists, the strategy becomes, to cite Ladson-Billings again, one of unmasking and exposing racism in its various permutations. This created the sense of racism as everything, everywhere, all the time, a permanent fixture, and that anti-racism needs to be embedded forever to mitigate that, as one participant says. And this is what participants say the structure of the Anti-Racist School Award provides: an opportunity to see racism in situ and develop strategies to protect against it. Nassar Mir writes on Derek Bell's concept of the permanence of racism that there's no likely end to the struggle for racial justice, only the promise this heralds and the desire to persevere even despite knowledge of likely failure. And this can bring up feelings of prolonged collective mourning and melancholia arising in those committed to fighting for racial justice. The Black Lives Matter street protests throughout summer of 2020 injected many of the award leaders with this new cognizance of a perceived systemic racism crisis and an awakening to the affective and psychic impact of race and racism, not only on Black men at the hands of American police, but in our own schools, by our own hands, on our own students and colleagues. So an understanding of racism in this way brings some award leaders to acknowledge racism is not coincidental and an unfortunate output of human social life, but it's embedded in everything, everywhere, all the time. This is about life and death, and this is going to be, as described in the quote, forever work. So historical accounts of resistance to racism within the UK education sector, such as the response to the racist murder of London schoolboy Stephen Lawrence, bear witness to how time and again those pursuing racial justice may start with a moment of perceived temporality of crisis in which teachers and leaders are struck by the harm and viciousness of racialization while forming an understanding of its entanglement in all aspects of all lives. Racial justice requires this realism and praxis that can acknowledge the permanence of racism while still holding to pockets of hope and possibility as described by Smith and Lander and Joseph Salisbury and Connolly. This is the cruel optimism of racial justice work as described by Nassar Mir. White ignorance and interest conversion, CRT theorists see race as a social construct that's both visible to people of colour and invisible to whites. This epistemology of ignorance, this white ignorance instituted in the white-dominated education sector in the UK is central to the way that it produces and reproduces racism. Interest convergent acknowledges that there are ways to help white people see racism and even shift the power relations, but posits that change will only happen if there are specific gains to be made for whites as a result. Interest convergence is rooted in the notion that interest in achieving racial equity only advances when the interests of those in power converge with those seeking change and they feel threatened enough or, given the impetus to act. As such, a critical analysis of whiteness, it's not an attack on white people, but as Gilbourne says, it's an assault on the socially constructed and constantly reinforced power of white identifications and interests, and an attempt to understand the systems which undergird racialized power structures and advantage whites. So CRT and CWS are powerful ways to clearly see how white identities are created, co-opted and mobilized through systemic power structures which uphold and maintain white supremacy within their infrastructure. Again, bringing this to life with white ignorance and interest convergence in mind, it's imperative to explore in more detail what drives some education professionals and their school leadership towards anti-racist practice, and whether they understand this as a result of pressure, a placatory act to create harmony, or a more radical move that's grounded in dismantling oppressive and discriminatory power structures in our schools as reflecting a microcosm of wider society. So asking, how did you come to be leading on anti-racism work across your school? Did you jump or were you pushed? Elicits varied responses, and nearly all of those referenced George Floyd's murder as the prime motivator, a pressure point or a moment of awakening. For some school leaders, the award is a way to show commitment and gain recognition. For white leaders who've not had to notice before, the violence of race and racism can eventually jump them without necessarily pushing them to immediately act. As one participant says, it was right around the time of George Floyd. We need to hold fire on doing assemblies. We need to hold fire on doing this because we don't actually know how to talk about it. One participant explains how racism that she noticed over a period of a decade at the school was often brushed off by colleagues as her oversensitivity or misunderstanding intentions. In the post-George Floyd moment, racism is now suddenly visible and colleagues of colour are asked to share their personal experiences of racial discrimination with other staff members. And this staff member was jumped by this sudden and inappropriate interest in racial trauma. She reflects on how poor her colleagues' understanding is and was jumped by their insistence. And she says, I was just like, no, it's not okay the way that they wanted that to happen. As critical whiteness scholar Barbara Applebaum suggests, here we see a recentering of whiteness by sacrificing the needs of the marginalized to the needs of the systemically privileged. And this form of what's described as predatory white anti-racism by another CEWS researcher, Paul Badenhorst, is a state of addictive atonement which hinges on the suffering of Black and brown peoples that serves as an impetus for change among white people. And that's what's required to ensure such change. So there's this fine line between engaging in what's sometimes described as voyeuristic trauma porn and needing to know about lived experiences of racially minoritized colleagues in order to ensure that they'll be safe from harm going forward. So that those nuances of jumping and being jumped, pushing and being pushed are really significant here. So my research findings document deep personal processes which each award leader experiences. And for the purposes of my presentation, I'll focus on these conclusions on 3 key recommendations for the sector arising from my findings more broadly. So first off, understanding the motivations for engaging in anti-racism work, deep understanding as described by Walker et al. Of the motivations for engaging in anti-racism work can support greater cognizance of how race and racism are socially constructed, how they operate and are reproduced within public institutions such as schools, and how structural racism is, as Stuart Hall says, just how things are, unless we make it our business to disrupt. Individuals should critically engage with and be grounded in their own positionality around race and identity and understand how it shapes them, but locating the site of struggle with the individual mustn't thwart an understanding of the social construction of race and reproduction of racism, as this will weaken the potential for collective action against racism. Therefore, alongside personal engagement with positionality, understanding the motivations of their school for engaging with anti-racism work can be pivotal. And that critical understanding of both personal and organizational reasons can help schools and leaders avoid falling into well-trodden paths to traps such as saviour complexes and doing good or expending effort on distancing themselves from being perceived as complicit or not racist. Second off, racial literacy. So across the board, educators leading on anti-racism work have not been furnished with knowledge about history, social movements and conceptual basics of racial literacy. So a fulsome curriculum for racial literacy could support teachers and leaders' work in identifying racist structures, systems and processes, strategizing a way forward and developing anti-racist praxis in themselves and others. We stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So where there's racism, there's always been resistance and strategic organizing in opposition to racisms, which shapeshift and iterate to always remain available as a societal organizing tool. And as such, anti-racism efforts need to be informed to be iterative and agile based on a clear understanding of the formations and operations of racisms. A key element of racial literacy is knowledge about the specifics of race, racism, and anti-racism over time and in the context of the UK. Finally, investment is key. So investment in the form of funding, time, resources, both material and in terms of personnel, are essential for anti-racism efforts to take off, be sustainable and successful in the long term. So anti-racism can't be a passion project of a few members of staff with skin in the game or in their spare time. It needs persistence, stamina, as well as to be a whole school endeavour and part of professional standards for school staff. It can't be solely top down or only driven from the bottom up. Anti-racism as a strategy for whole school culture change can't happen without significant and sustained investment. With these 3 key recommendations in place, anti-racism is integral to school processes, practices, cultures and policies that could become reality where individuals and institutions can stay with the trouble, to cite Donna Haraway, despite this cruel optimism of racial justice work. Thank you.